for today before the fellows only session. This session is about star formation, and we only have two talks. The first talk is by Mike Grudic. Did I share your family or the
Grudic.
Grudic, sorry. So we'll be telling us about why our stars. Go ahead, thank you.
Thanks a lot. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Okay, hi everyone. I'm Mike. I'm a third-year fellow at Carnegie, and I'm going to talk to you today about just some thoughts I have about this whole star formation thing. So I don't know if you've ever asked yourself this, but why are stars? Why are stars a thing? Why is our galaxy made of? Maybe it sounds really silly, but here's sort of where I'm coming from with this. So let's have a look at the IMF. So this is a plot of the IMF slope for many different measurements in a compilation that I did as a function of stellar mass range indicated by the horizontal bars. And you can see the sort of saltpeter slope that it sort of asymptotes to at large masses. And you get this sort of characteristic peak stellar mass between about 0.1 and 0.3 solar masses. So this is sort of the mass of thing that the galaxy likes to make in the interstellar medium. To first order, the galaxy is just a machine for turning gas into M-dwarfs, and everything else, both larger masses and smaller masses, us, is just sort of detritus. It doesn't really care. It really likes to make M-dwarfs. And it's actually not so trivial to understand why that is. And this will be important later, but I'd also like to point out that some of these shallower slopes seen at high masses are in the galactic center, where things are very dense. So that'll be important later. But yeah, back to this question, why do we have all these M-dwarfs flying around? Well, first I'd like to sort of apologize for my field and just kind of give you some intuition for why we haven't figured this out yet. So consider, for example, the early universe large-scale structure. The initial conditions are very well characterized. You can do perturbation theory, things are nice and smooth, not a lot of nasty microphysics. Similarly, galaxies, they're in a quasi-equilibrium. You know the geometry, you know the dominant motion, you can model them in reduced dimensionality. And similar with protoplanetary disks, and similar with stars, which are, in essentially hydrostatic equilibrium. You can, run your 1D MESA model and it gets most things right. And then we have molecular clouds. So molecular clouds are just really nasty to model theoretically. They're inherently three-dimensional objects. They have nothing even resembling an equilibrium to attract towards, because there's both self-gravitating and highly dissipative. So there's just a sort of constant gravithermal catastrophe happening, and there's lots of different physics at work. Right, so essentially, the universe is sort of resisting our attempts to understand how stars form, and that battleground is at the stage of molecular clouds. So if we fire up my little ISM simulator, let's hope this works. Yeah, so here we're plotting the temperature of the ISM as a function of density. This is an app that you can play around with, and you can vary all these different sorts of things, including which cooling processes are accounted for, and the metallicity and the redshift and all these different things. But what you always find is that at high enough density, you end up more or less at about 10 Kelvin in sort of Milky Way star forming conditions, because the gas is very well coupled to the dust. The dust really wants to be at a certain temperature. So a very bright guy by the name of Fred Hoyle realized many years ago that this was kind of an interesting thing, because if you have isothermal gas, then if you have an overdense structure that is self-gravitating, it's not going to disperse, right? It's going to collapse, and then it's going to want to fragment into smaller things and smaller things and so on and so on. So where does this even end? And this is in fact exactly what we see in numerical simulations. So when we simulate star formation, where the only equations are isothermal hydrodynamics and gravity, then we get no IMF whatsoever. There is no mass scale. What happens is things just fragment to smaller and smaller itty-bitty bits. And as you turn up the resolution, you just get smaller objects. And this is sort of a consensus at this point. But there's actually a sort of really old idea that's kind of enjoyed a sort of revival lately, which is the opacity limit. This was originally proposed in the sort of very early works in the 60s and 70s on star formation. And the idea here is that if you have a collapsing fragment, it'll start off isothermal, but it can't be isothermal forever. Essentially, once you pass a certain threshold where the rate at which energy can be transported out of the collapsing clump is slower than the free fall time, then cooling no longer works. The temperature has to start rising, and when the temperature rises, it rises in such a way that the Jeans mass starts to rise, and that sort of sets a limit on how small a thing you can form. Now, this minimum Jeans mass is something like a Jupiter mass, so it's a far throw from a Jupiter mass to an M dwarf mass, but maybe if the geometry and the tidal forces and everything sort of work out, then you could sort of translate this to the IMF peak. And I should also point out that in a recent work, I worked out this opacity limit mass in sort of a greater level of detail than had been done before. Turns out it varies very weakly with dust opacity or metallicity until you get to a certain amount of radiation field, in which case it sort of scales more strongly. So you'd actually expect a less bottom-heavy IMF in high radiation dust-rich environments. But people have taken the sort of effective equation of state from this opacity limit idea and fired it off in numerical simulations. And it turns out that they do get fairly reasonable looking IMFs. So in other words, this opacity limit is imprinting this peak of the IMF, and these people have done convergence tests, and they find that they get something that's essentially independent of resolution. So that's good. There's some physics here. We're getting an IMF. I wanted to see if I could reproduce this with the Gizmo code, because both of those studies were with Ramses. And I actually found a very similar result, where if I vary where the opacity limit lives, then I can form a bunch of brown dwarfs, or I can form a bunch of K dwarfs. If I get it just right, then I peak at M dwarfs. So it looks pretty good, but this was a very dense clump. It's actually not characteristic of the typical cloud that is forming stars in the Milky Way. If I form stars in something less dense with the same model, I get this sort of nasty, very flat thing that has just way too many massive stars. In a very, very normal GMC, that should have a very normal looking IMF. So this is actually a more general thing that we found even without any of these thermal physics. Just isothermal MHD plus gravity, we find that Milky Way typical conditions like to make lots and lots of very massive stars. So there's sort of a problem here essentially as soon as we switch on MHD. So my next question is, why are massive stars rare? So I'm gonna let the audience call things out. Why do you think massive stars are rare? And anybody? What's missing here? Come on, be brave. What makes it hard to make a massive star? It's probably feedback. So this was the idea of the StarForge project, was we wanted to do numerical simulations of star formation that accounted for all of the different relevant physics that we thought might be important. And most crucially, these are the first numerical simulations to account for every different type of stellar feedback acting in concert. So you have protostellar jets, you have stellar winds, you have radiation, and you have supernovae, and this is all acting in concert with MHD and cooling and chemical physics and body dynamics. And we follow every single star that forms as it collapses and it creates gas and moves around in the star cluster. So a sort of narrative has been emerging for how the IMF works. We've basically varied the different physics in the simulations and been able to reverse engineer what sets the different features in the IMF. So this is from that previous study I showed you, where we had just isothermal MHD and no other physics. And we get this nasty sort of overly top-heavy thing. If we do a more realistic job of the cooling and the chemistry physics, then it's basically the same thing, perhaps even worse. As soon as we switch on protostellar jets, the IMF starts to look more reasonable. We stop getting this very shallow slope with lots and lots of massive stars. There's still a little bit of an excess at the high mass end. But finally, once we account for all of the different feedback physics acting in concert, the IMF looks actually pretty reasonable. We get the maximum stellar mass more or less in the right place. So what we've found from StarForge is essentially that protostellar jets are largely responsible for setting the kind of turnover in the IMF from the saltpeter slope to the flat portion. The opacity limit seems like the most robust mechanism for setting the sort of lower bound on the massive stars that you can form. In this case, it's not actually resolved in these simulations, but in higher resolution simulations, we find that. And radiation and winds from massive stars regulates the high mass tail. Now, that high mass tail is very interesting because we were interested in whether the maximum stellar mass we got was just due to a size of sample effect, or whether it was actually due to some sort of physical cutoff. So what we did was run 100 low mass clouds and see what IMF we get. And we get this very confidently constrained cutoff in the upper mass. Moreover, we compare this to just one high mass cloud, and this one high mass cloud is sufficient to make a more massive star, even though it has fewer stars overall. So what we think is that the upper IMF cutoff in the simulations is not just a size of sample effect, it's set by feedback physics, and it depends on cloud properties. And this is sort of a natural thing. If you consider basically any sort of feedback you like, and you ask how much feedback do you need to disrupt a cloud within free fall time, you inevitably end up getting something that scales with both the mass and the surface density of the cloud, whether you want radiation pressure or wind feedback or photoionization. It always works something qualitatively like this, some power of n and sigma, the surface density that is positive. So it's easier to form more massive stars in denser, more massive clouds, it seems. It's in fact a very natural thing that we should expect a sort of variable upper limit on the mass of a star you can make. Now, I was interested in just sort of pushing this to its most extreme conclusion. I got interested in these sort of crazy looking, actively star forming high redshift galaxies that people were finding. So these things have star formation intensities and radiation fields about 10,000 times what is found in the solar neighborhood. They have modest metallicity. They have a warmer CMB, and they're just some of the most extreme star forming conditions we've ever seen, I think. So this is cloud simulated at 1% solar metallicity in a radiation field that's sort of appropriate for redshift of 10. What we find when I fire this thing off is actually that this thing makes really, really massive stars. So the maximum stellar mass that I find in this high redshift simulation is 970 solar masses. But this was a surprise to me because, again, this same model does very reasonable things in solar neighborhood conditions. And of course, the IMF here is very top heavy. The light to mass ratio is very high. Now, this is a huge list of caveats because I actually have no idea what feedback from 1,000 solar mass star even looks like, or whether this thing is even stable as it accretes. So I don't want you to believe my quantitative story here, but I want you to consider my qualitative story that very dense, low metallicity conditions are a very nice place to make some very massive stars. So we've touched on three important questions about the IMF. Why stars exist, basically the opacity limit and magnetic fields regulate fragmentation. Why massive stars are rare. I think the main thing is that protostellar jets are regulating how much mass stars can accrete. And why very massive stars are very rare. And the answer here is that feedback regulates star formation on the scale of the cloud, cutting off the cloud scale flows that feed individual massive stars. So some key take-homes here. One is that the IMF is shaped by all sorts of different processes. It would require an elaborate conspiracy of physics for this to work the same way everywhere in the universe. So I'd say keep an open mind about the IMF. I think these things can vary. I think IMF variations are on the table, for example, when interpreting what we're seeing with JWST. And in fact, I think that these high redshift, low metallicity, high surface density conditions are perfect for forming very massive stars. It'll be a while before the dust settles on the specifics, but I think the key uncertainties here are really the initial conditions and how these very massive stars actually evolve in terms of feedback. All right, thanks.
Thank you, Mike, for this interesting talk and nice simulations. We have time for a couple of questions. I would ask a question while people think. In one of the plotted or like simulation results actually where you showed different scales and you zoomed in up to like 1000 AU or 100 AU, if you can go back to this one, please. Yeah, this one. So what you're seeing at 1000 AU is this kind of like a ring structure. Can you elaborate more on what you're seeing over there?
So that is a rotationally supported disk structure. It's very, very marginally resolved at the mass resolution of the simulation. But yeah, we have a sort of multiple stellar system with a disk around it there.
I see. Cool. That's interesting.
Kind of a random question, but we heard earlier in the week about binary stars. Just curious, maybe you mentioned it, but have you learned anything about the fraction of stars that are in binary that is high redshift?
At high redshift, I haven't looked at this. We do have a paper out where we look at multiplicity properties. What we actually find is that the binary fraction is lower in higher density environments. So sort of extrapolating that to these very dense clusters I'd expect at high redshift, there might be an effect there, but I think that's a bit of a reach. But yeah, the reference is Guseynov et al. 2022. I can send you the link.
One last quick question.
Sorry, maybe I've missed it. Which these results would change in your mind if a different IMF would be used? I don't know in any of this.
I mean, the IMF, do you mean like in terms of applying the IMF to other things or within the scope of the simulations?
Anything really. You just mentioned really briefly that we need to be careful about which IMF we use in interpreting Chavez results. What did you mean?
Well, I mean, the IMF affects everything. Like it affects how much feedback you have, what you need to know for your galaxy information model. It affects how many gravitational wave events you're going to have, and like, it affects how much light is coming from galaxies. It affects everything, right? Sorry, does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Cool. Thank you, Mark. Let's thank Mark again.
Thank you.
Now we have our next speaker. It's Tucker. You want to?
Yes.
So now we have it's not sharing.
Where's the share screen button?
You're still sharing.
Okay, let's.
Okay, nice.
Let's work out.
Yes, that's the one.
You wanna play?
That was
Is it good? Okay, so now we have Kartheik Iyer, who's going to tell us about how it's a self-consistent physical model for star formation in galaxies.
Yes. Thank you. And a huge thank you to the organizers and to the stewards of this program for doing an incredible job. It's a privilege to be here and listen to everyone talk about such cool science. For the purposes of this talk, we have to assume stars are, so I'm really glad Mike went before me. And before I jump into the meat of my talk, I first want to thank with huge acknowledgements to firstly a wonderful network of collaborators that are sources of guidance and inspiration, and for me surviving the pandemic in more ways than one. To a bunch of incredible students that I've had the pleasure of working with and doing really cool projects. And to all the people who develop, maintain, and put time and energy into making open source software that makes so much of our science possible. So thank you. I'm Kartheik Iyer, and I'm finishing the first year of my fellowship. And because this is my first time here in person, I wanted to start off with things that I spend my time thinking about. So for the biggest fraction of my time, I think about what makes galaxies form stars, and eventually sometimes stop forming stars. Because I'm more of an astrostatistician, instead of looking at individual, like really high signal to noise, pristine observations, I tend to work with ensembles of kind of noisy, all over the place, systematics dominated samples, and there's so much fun to be had there with the stats. Because we tend to do science in large groups, I've been thinking a lot about how we can be better at communicating our science and our ideas to our peers and to the wider field and to our students as well. So how do we be better teachers, better mentors? As new observatories come up, things like Rubin and Euclid, we're going to have a huge profusion of data. And so as data sets scale, as simulations scale, how does the methods that we use keep up with it? And finally, if you look outside astronomy, we tend to use things in machine learning that sort of benefit our science. But that field is evolving on a much shorter half-life than we tend to do in astronomy. So sometimes if we couple ourselves to something like this, it drags us kicking and screaming into an uncertain future. So I tend to think a lot about what that does. But all of these, while they look like disparate questions, are all part of the same story. A story that I like to tell with this plot. So this is a map of the lands that span galaxy evolution papers. Right? We all live here to some extent. There's also similar places for, cosmology is a separate continent, but it's making bridges. There's the Aegean Islands down below where people tend to think of accretion disks and dust tori. If you care about dust, you can travel up that narrow strait to the molecular cloud bluffs, where people sometimes worship a strange deity called Alma. I think Seiji knows about this. But our story, or at least the one that I want to tell today, starts somewhere below the morphology forests, where people spend a lot of time thinking about what's going on when it comes to galaxies. So this is a sort of why are galaxies slide, in the sense that there's a strange dichotomy that when you look at galaxies or when you measure almost any physical property, you find this incredible diversity amongst galaxy populations. But then when you look at ensembles of galaxies, you see them follow these very standard scaling relations across many, many different properties. So there's this apparent contradiction where how can something be so diverse and also follow all of these emergent laws? And the incredible people who live in those spots, right? Like they've been thinking about this for a while, and they came up with a picture that says that there's many different physical processes across many different spatial and temporal scales that's responsible for regulating star formation in galaxies, and that affects everything about them. That affects their growth, it affects how they look, and sort of understanding and characterizing the timescales on which these different things operate and constraining their relative strengths is what's going to tell us exactly what leads to a galaxy presenting the way it does. This is too many processes though. So in practice, what we end up doing is saying effective processes and chunking it up into timescales and then studying things on discrete timescales. And the reason we're able to do this at all is because different stellar populations tend to leave unique spectral signatures in different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. And we can essentially use signals that are sensitive to certain timescales and pairs of these signals that are sensitive to certain timescales to come up with constraints on how a galaxy's stars formed over time. So this has been my obsession over the last few years, and I hope I can make it yours too. But star formation history is a record of how a galaxy formed its stars over time. The reason I'm so fascinated by it is because you can build forward modeling or inference mechanisms to try to infer this from observations of all sorts. Ranging from color magnitude diagrams at low redshift to like JWST near-term photometry. And then you can look at these star formation histories in the context of analytical models or cosmological simulations to try to figure out how it relates to the physics that's going into those things. So it forms the sort of intermediate space that allows us to connect observations and simulations and study them on this common footing. Right? So most of my talk is going to be observational, but I'm happy to talk about simulations. 12 minutes is a bit short, so ask me about anything in here that you find interesting. But suppose you are looking at this parameter space, right? You're an observer, you use a telescope to observe a galaxy, you analyze it somehow and compute what redshift it's at and how massive it is and whether it's forming stars or not. That allows you to plop it into this parameter space. This is for individual galaxies, and you can study them. When you start looking at ensembles of galaxies, it fills up the space and gives you all of these really cool looking emergent scaling relations. And these relations themselves evolve over time or over redshift. So one of JWST's mandates has been to figure out how the first stars and the first galaxies formed. And one way to do this is to just go out there and look. So Sears, and like, this is stuff that Rohan and Seiji and folks are going to be experts in, so I'm going to defer to them. But one way of doing this is to just go and find the highest redshift objects that you can see. The other way, if you have access to star formation history information, is to sort of trace a galaxy back a long time along its star formation trajectory to predict what its properties are going to be like at parts of observational space that you have difficulty accessing, either because it's too high in redshift or too low in mass. So this is a tool called dense spaces that I've been developing over the last few years. And up until recently, it was mostly being developed, being tested extensively, applied to small data sets. And then since JWST came online, there's been this profusion of really cool individual galaxies that we have been able to sort of apply this to, sometimes for very simple things like just figuring out what the redshift and mass and star formation data are, but sometimes for really cool things. So an example is the Sparkler galaxy, where it's a galaxy from the SMACS 0723 initial data release, where with Hubble, it looked just like an unresolved edge on disk. But with JWST, we realized that it's a lensed galaxy magnified by a factor of almost 100. And there's all of these small dots around it. And then we went in and we did photometry of those tiny star clusters, and we got the star formation histories, and we found that they formed like 500 million years after the Big Bang. So this is insane, because this could be us seeing globular clusters at really high redshifts, a use case that I didn't even think was possible. Are they actually globular clusters, or are they just candidates? We don't know, but we're going to get spectra in cycle 2, so we will find out. Yoshi Asada did this really cool analysis where he looked at 2 lensed high redshift galaxies merging and used their star formation histories to figure out whether there's coherent signals in them that would indicate a merging system. So there's all of these really nice applications that people have been doing, but my bread and butter lies with statistical ensemble level studies. So the thing I've been looking at is essentially saying, can we get these large fields for which we can compute the star formation histories of hundreds of thousands of galaxies, layer them and figure out emergent trends in how they evolve, whether things split into different populations, and whether these things correlate in some way with other observables that we see. So there's a bunch of papers that sort of look at different aspects of this. I looked at quenching and rejuvenation statistics across redshift. People have been looking at the morphological evolution of galaxies and whether signatures in their star formation histories correlate with that, especially as these galaxies go through the Green Valley to quench. Caleb Lammers is this incredible student that it was an absolute pleasure to work with. And he looked at resolved star formation histories of galaxies in manga to see if there's signatures of AGN feedback in how things are radially quenching. And Cami Bajafici did this wonderful meta-analysis where we took essentially results from fitting the same data with 14 different codes and did this comparison to figure out like modeling assumptions and the systematics that get introduced because of that. You'll notice that there's only one JWST paper in here, and that's because for these kinds of large samples, we are still figuring out systematics and calibration issues and priors and all of these things. So hopefully there'll be more of this when I come back next year to talk about this. Okay, let's go back to this briefly. We have all of these different timescales, and suppose you care about how bursty star formation is, but don't want to go to the trouble of actually fitting star formation histories. Then you can marginalize over the star formation histories and just think about distributions of these observables and their covariances. So going back to ensembles, if you model a population of galaxies with simple models where you have things like inflows, outflows, feedback that heats up gas or heats it out of galaxies, and some of that gas then falls back in to start forming a second generation of stars, you can assign timescales to this, and you can use that to formulate a power spectrum. This power spectrum can then be used to draw star formation histories, and here I'm showing examples for different kinds of power spectra that would emulate things that are either very smooth or very bursty, or things that are correlated over long time scales versus very uncorrelated, depending on feedback conditions, inflow conditions, things like that. And then you can translate that to actual spectra, and then you can calculate the spectral features. So this essentially marginalizes overall the star formation histories and gives you distributions of spectral features for populations of galaxies. And what you can do is see that individual features don't really tell you much, but ensemble observations where you have tens to hundreds to thousands of galaxies can give you constraints on burstiness for an entire population or correlation timescales for an entire population. And this is something we can do with JWST, and I'm very excited to do that. One of the reasons I'm excited is because I was looking a few years back at a simulation where I computed curves of its power spectra as a function of stellar mass. And I was seeing these really neat features, and I thought, oh, I can connect that to physics, right? Like the things that are going on influence how bursty star formation is. And then as a sanity check, I looked at a bunch of other simulations and found that they're all over the place. So this made me sad because I couldn't make any direct conclusions in that paper, but it made me happy because observational constraints in this space that we'll get from these kinds of ensemble observations will be an entirely novel constraint that people aren't using so far to tune feedback across a range of redshifts. All right, so that's a quick summary. SFHS and simulations tell you things. Gaussian processes and this framework can encode things. And simulations varying feedback can be used to understand the connection to physics. Now, I can stop here. If people are willing to wait for 2 more minutes, I can tell you about this. How do people feel? Yes? All right. So back in February, there was a KITP workshop on data-driven astronomy, and I happened to meet Joe Juka and Yuan Zenteng and a bunch of people who were really interested in this notion of what will large language models do for astronomy. And I was coming at it from the point of, oh, I want to do better literature searches, right? I hate missing a paper when I'm writing. I hate missing, like, citing a relevant paper when I'm writing something. And I know that grad students and undergrads find it very difficult to find relevant references when they're starting out in a topic. So we essentially wanted to build a collection of papers. So this is actually coming from a representation of astroph.galaxy papers, where every point is a paper from archive. And the way we built this, it is able to answer simple questions like what's the Sirsic index of a disk? And it'll tell you, oh, so the Sirsic index of a disk is around 1. And it'll tell you where in that space that answer came from. And you can see that it actually comes from the morphology forests because you're asking about Sirsic indices. But you can also ask it slightly more complex questions, like what are the biggest discoveries with JWST so far? And it will try to synthesize answers. And always, whenever you ask it a question, it gives you primary sources that, like, this is where I drew the answer from, and those sources have to be real. And it gives you a list of other interesting papers that you could probably go and read. And we have essentially been building this, and we have been building other tools that do things like hypothesis generation or answering questions or doing these sort of embedding based things. So if anyone wants to go and try this, please feel free to. If you break it, then that's good feedback for me because then I can go and fine tune it further. We also made something called AstroLlama, which is like a fine tuned astronomy specific model that can do these kinds of things. And this started out as a group of like 3-4 people, and we are now 40 plus and growing. So I think because the field is growing so rapidly, there's so much to be done. So, summary, star formation histories are cool. Ask me about those. AstroLlama is cool. Ask me about that. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That's very interesting. Have time for 3 questions.
When you're doing the population statistical analysis applied to observations, to what extent are you affected by or can you account for its observational selection effects?
Oh yeah, we're heavily affected by selection effects. So there's 2 kinds of studies to do there. One is sort of studies where you do self-consistency checks, where you essentially say that, like, oh, I have some results at redshift 2 and some results at redshift 3, and I should be able to translate the redshift 2 things back to 3 and check for self-consistency. And the parts where you start missing out is usually a way to quantify selection effects in addition to like completeness simulations and other things. The other thing that comes in place is the kind of priors that we use when we run these pipelines. So It's not to the level where like cosmologists have to figure out things like 1 part in 1,000. We are still at the place where our systematics are factor of 2-ish, but there's still a significant effect. And the meta-analysis that I talked about that Cami Pacharichi carried out is one of the things that really helped with sort of beating down that selection bias.
Other questions?
I have a kind of fun science one about your archives map thing.
Yeah.
Just curious, on the axes there with all the points of the archive papers, what are the X and Y axes?
Right, so they don't mean anything because this is a UMAP plot. So what we do is when we run every archive abstract through the model, it produces a very high dimensional vector. And so it's actually a very high dimensional space that it does all of its searches and stuff in, but this is just for visualization. We compress all of that down to like 2 dimensions. So the only thing that matters is that similar papers are close together and the similar papers are far away. And oh, the other cool thing is like gaps. So places with forests are the places that are well studied. They're the ones that have a lot of work done on them. And places where there's water is where there's not yet papers. So essentially JWST Valley has to have been a valley because it's doing science that couldn't have been done before. And it's filling up like that. There would have been water if you look back, if you go back in time and look. So that's also a really neat way to sort of figure out, yeah, as a community, how we're doing.
About that, I have a question. Do you know of other fields that are trying to, like other groups and other fields that are trying to do something similar? So I know this is mostly about galaxies. And
Yeah.
so maybe people are working on transients, radio flash, I don't know, doing something similar.
So within astronomy, we tried to make this model called Astrolama, which is across all fields, not just galaxies. And outside astronomy, I know a bunch of groups who are trying all sorts of different things. There's also like, the main thing is like you need GPU resources and you need access to data. The GPU resources you can get by writing a grant, but astronomy is uniquely positioned in the fact that most of our data, most of our code is all public. And so I think as a way to prototype these models and see if it can scale to other fields, we are in a very unique position.
Awesome. Thank you. Cool. That's